Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be thinking today about the FIEC itself. What is it? Why do we need it? And I'm joined today by John Stevens, who's our National Director, and Phil Topham, who's our Executive Director. Phil, one of your roles here in the FIEC is thinking about affiliations, helping churches join the FIEC. Why should an independent church, which we've heard so much about in a previous episode, why should an independent church want to join something like the FIEC?
I think the best quote I heard from one of our pastors when I asked him that question was that FIEC lifts our horizons. And what he meant by that was it doesn't just mean that our church in isolation is the most important thing, but actually it lets us know there is gospel work going on amongst independents all around the country. We can have partnership with, fellowship with, and be encouraged by. So that we're not just thinking about our locality, but actually we're thinking about the work of the gospel across the country. And FIEC helps to lift their horizons.
That makes it sound just like a mission organisation. I could get that by joining, being an affiliate of OM or something, couldn't I?
Well, absolutely. But the difference is we believe the local church is where the action is. So actually, a mission organisation, the action's not always in the local church. FIEC believes in the local church, and therefore it's really important that those local churches are able to connect with one another, have fellowship with one another, work together with one another to see the gospel in our land go out. Sometimes I talk about it a bit like Acts 1:8, where when Jesus says, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the ends of the earth." Your Jerusalem is your local ministry. The ends of the earth is your kind of world mission, but your Judea and Samaria, your national mission, is the FIEC. So we're not a mission organisation, but we are absolutely missional in the fact that we believe churches working together enables the work of the gospel to move forward across the nation. So it is partly that.
Well, I like that, but I still feel you haven't quite sold it to me. So I'm a local church pastor. I might have other connections. I might have grown up in a different denomination. I might know different people. Why should my church, not just me as a person, be interested in FIEC? Why should my church be part of FIEC?
Well, I always like to try and flip the question round. So I don't think it's really about what you gain from FIEC. It's what you can bring to FIEC is just as important. So if we believe in fellowship, that biblical word koinonia in the Greek, gathering together for a common purpose, it's absolutely vital that we have churches of all shapes and sizes fellowshipping with us. So that means that the church in a very rural location, the church in an urban deprived location, a large church in a city centre, a student church thriving with young Christians. We need all of these churches to be part of the FIEC. So we actually represent Christian faith across the country as it is an independent. So it's not just about what you can gain from being part of FIEC. What can you bring to FIEC? Can we connect you with a church that's similar to you in another part of the country? So let me give you an example of that, Adrian. Church recently joined us from a rural coastal town. So very much a holiday destination. A lot of people descend on them in the summer months, but then it's very quiet in the winter months. They're a small congregation, but in the summer they could blossom with 90, 100 people on a Sunday because everyone's descended on them for their summer holidays. They don't have much in common with the churches around them, not even in their region, but they do have things in common with other churches in similar locations around the country that might be 150, 200 miles from them. They can gain that partnership and that fellowship by joining the FIEC. So it's not just about their doorstep and where they are. It is that national horizon, that fellowshipping and what they can bring to our family as much as what they can get out of it. Now, of course, there is stuff people get out of belonging to FIEC, but that I think is more important.
Well, we'll come back to that perhaps in a moment. John, FIEC is almost 100 years old, 1922 it was formed. Tell us why it was formed at the outset.
Yeah, the FIEC was founded in 1922. E.J. Poole Connor was at that time working as the deputation secretary for a mission sort of organisation, was travelling around the country. And as he did that, he came to recognise that there were lots of isolated independent churches and mission halls. And he saw a real need to want to be able to provide support and help for them. So out of that experience, the vision emerged of
what did he mean by
FIEC.
support and help?
He wanted those churches to be able to enjoy some of the benefits that denominations enjoyed, but without actually forming a denomination that would control them. So when the FIEC was founded, the goal was to enable those churches to help and support one another. It was rather quaintly described as a society of mutual helpfulness. And the key things that he identified that those churches needed was a degree of doctrinal accountability by their fellowship with one another, a sense of accreditation for both ministers and churches that would give them some credibility within the wider society, a commitment to training and helping pastors and leaders to be properly equipped for the role that they wanted to do, the ability to enable those churches to work together for church planting, and one of the goals was always to lead to the establishment of more gospel works. There was also a desire to take the burden off local church leaders by providing practical advice that would help them with the many challenges that were being faced. Paul Connor, one of the distinctives about the FIEC was that there had always been associations of independent churches. So right from the very beginning of the development of independency in the 16th and 17th century, independent churches had formed networks, associations, local groupings to help and support one another. Those had evolved into what might be described as denominations, the Congregational Union and the Baptist Union. In the early part of the 20th century, those groupings were denominated by particular sort of positions on what Paul Connor regarded as secondary issues. So you could only belong to the Congregationalist Union if you, for example, were a Peter Baptist. You could only belong to the Baptist Union if you were a Baptist. There was actually relatively little interaction between those different sort of groups. And Paul Connor had a vision for a unity that was based in the core doctrines of the gospel, not those secondary issues that were the characteristics of denominations. And so therefore there was a desire to want to model a gospel unity around key issues of salvation, but to enable fellowship across those historic divisions over secondary issues. So those were the founding visions for FIEC. Originally, there was a relatively small number of churches that belonged, the majority of which had come from a Brethren background. And really, over the last 100 years, the FIEC has grown, and as more and more churches have shared that desire to want to come together on a core gospel commitment, sharing fellowship with those who might hold different views on secondary issues, but wanting to help and support one another, especially for that missional objective of getting the gospel out to the nation. So today we've got 635 churches, and our desire is to want to be independent churches working together to reach Britain for Christ. And that really encapsulates what FIEC is all about. FIEC is not necessary for a local church. We recognise that, and independent churches, we're not saying they've got to join, they've got the choice to join. But FIEC really exists to add a missional dimension to local independent churches that enables them to work together to reach the nation, and particularly to support and invest in the future of independency. So if we do have theological convictions about independent churches, and we want to train and raise up people who have a confidence in independency and will serve independency in the future, nobody else is going to do that for us unless we do it for ourselves. And that's why FIEC exists.
Presumably, Phil, I mean, churches are free to join. They're free to leave as well, are they? Do churches leave the FIEC?
Of course.
Sort of once in, always in?
No,
or how does it work in practice?
That would fundamentally go against what we believe about independency, wouldn't it? So of course a church is free to leave. There are no handcuffs. So if a church comes to a different theological conviction on a certain issue, then they would want to leave potentially, and that was absolutely fine. Churches will often decide that they have got more in common with another group, for example, and might leave. It is worth saying that we are growing, so there are more churches joining than are leaving. But of course, churches are free to leave as they're free to join. And I think that's an important point you make there. I think one of the misconceptions about FIEC is that if you join FIEC, your church has to conform to be like FIEC churches. That's not true. You only join FIEC because you're already in that place. You already believe what we believe about our key doctrinal issues. You already believe what we believe about our ethos statements of ministry. So you don't amend your work and ministry to come and join us. You're doing that already, and you want to join us because you share those convictions.
Is there an average FIEC church?
I don't think we have an average, do we? I wouldn't have thought so.
What would you say, John?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of churches leaving, I think it's worth saying over the last 10 years, we've had over 200 churches that have joined FIEC and want to become part of it. The numbers of churches that have left are very, very small in comparison to that. I think most of the churches that have left because they've changed their position, particularly on, for example, women in ministry. So there have been a number of churches that have become egalitarian, and FIEC is a complementarian group, and at that point, they can't belong to FIEC. There are some churches that have been at what you might call the more conservative end of evangelicalism that have sort of found it difficult that FIEC has a spectrum of different views on issues like, for example, Bible translation or the use of spiritual gifts. And some of those of a more conservative end have wanted to be in associations which are exclusively conservative, and they've not remained in FIEC, but it's been a very small number of churches that have stayed. I think within FIEC, what you might call a centre of gravity. In other words, lots of FIEC churches would be fairly similar in the theological convictions they hold and the way that they do ministry. But that's very different from saying that they are the model of FIEC churches and every church needs to be like them. It's of the very essence of FIEC that we want to welcome independent churches that would share our core gospel convictions. And actually, in order to reach the nation, we need a wide diversity of different cultures of churches. And one of the exciting things over the last 10 years has been a growing number of churches joining FIEC that thought that FIEC had a very narrow particular view of what a local church ought to be like. But they've come to see that FIEC is actually much more like a coalition of evangelical churches that have a spectrum of different cultures. So, for example, some of our churches are in city centres, some are in suburban areas, some are in rural villages, some are in deprived communities. Sort of their theological spectrum ranges. So FIEC is not constitutionally reformed, although the majority of churches would identify with a Calvinistic soteriology. They're not exclusively Baptist. They're not exclusively amillennial. There's a spectrum of approaches. It's been great to see a growing number of churches that would self-identify as being charismatic, belonging to FIEC, because FIEC has never been anti-charismatic, but has wanted to recognise that that's a secondary issue. And I think sometimes we've been perceived as being a cessationist group of churches, but that's not true. The vast majority of our churches would probably adopt a kind of a continuationist view about the way that sort of spiritual gifts are to be used today. And actually, we've seen an increase in the number of churches that would be from a different ethnic background. And again, that's been thrillingly encouraging, particularly as the UK population changes. We're about 14% sort of non-white in the UK. I think our last data survey suggested that 16% of FIEC regular attenders come from a non-white kind of background. And it's been great to see a number of churches that are black majority churches beginning to join FIEC because they share its gospel convictions and they realise that they can be a part of FIEC because you don't have to conform to a particular culture. So we want to really model the a kind of unity of the broader body of Christ in core gospel convictions, but the diversity of culture and ethnicity that ought to be a feature of the church today.
I think it's really vital that what John's saying there, because I don't think we have an average, to go back to your original question. I think we don't have an average simply because there are churches joining us from all these different backgrounds, as John says, and more than that, not only are they all joining from different backgrounds, but actually the way they do their ministry is very different. So you don't become like the other FIEC church down the road if you join FIEC. You still keep your core convictions about who you are as a church. I remember going at the beginning of 2020 to a Tamil-speaking church in Rugby, which has joined the FIEC, and they're dancing in the aisles during the worship, and it was joyful and wonderful. But actually, a lot of our churches would just sort of be, or we don't want to get involved in that. But actually, isn't that wonderful that a church like that wants to identify with FIEC? They share our core gospel convictions. They want to be part of us. And that's why the average will continue to change if there is such a thing, because we've got so many different churches joining us.
I think, so as I said, 200 churches have joined us in the last 10 years. And it's been very noticeable as churches apply and they fill in our forms to want to become affiliated to belong to FIEC. It's been really striking to me that most of them say the same things about why they want to join, irrespective of whether they're a long-established independent church or a new church plant, irrespective of their culture. It's the same three things that they seem to say that has attracted them to FIEC, which are firstly that they want to join together with those who have like-minded gospel convictions. And I think in a post-Christian culture in which Orthodox Christian belief is increasingly seen as being intolerant or bigoted, actually they want to identify with others and feel that they're part of a bigger group that shares their core convictions. Some of our doctrinal positions for FIEC churches include, for example, complementarianism in relation to sort of the leadership of local churches, being very clear that sort of same-sex marriage is not biblical and that marriage is only for heterosexual kind of couples, wanting to join together only with those who share gospel convictions and not working ecumenically with those who are liberal or Catholic and deny those core gospel convictions. So people want to join together with those who share those fundamental beliefs. The second key thing is they say they want to be part of a national mission. So they already have a commitment to their own local community. They often have a commitment to world mission. The area that they've recognised that's really important is wanting to get the gospel out in the UK. We've been saying for those 10 years that there are only 2 or 3% of people who are born again evangelical believers in the UK. And so people want to be part of something that has a real vision for the nation. And the third thing they repeatedly say is they want to take advantage of the practical advice that FIEC is able to provide, able to help them to develop best practice in ministry, to take some of the burdens off the local church. And those are almost universally the reasons why churches say they want to become part of FIEC.
There are boundaries, aren't there, Phil? We've talked about some of the freedoms that there are, but obviously there are boundaries with a fellowship. What are those in terms of the FIEC?
In terms of joining, you mean? Yeah. So I think a church needs to agree with our doctrinal basis and our 3 ethos statements of ministry that John's just outlined. So they need to agree with those. A church needs to have at least 8 members. A church needs to be registered with the Charity Commission or be willing to become registered with the Charity Commission within 2 years of joining the FIEC. So those are kind of the key things. Or they need to be independent as well. That's the other one. So sometimes churches fall at the first hurdle there. They're not actually independent. They're part of a denomination. So you can't belong to FIEC and also be part of a controlling formal denomination. So there are boundaries for churches joining, but within those boundaries, there's freedom to be faithful.
Okay. So the doctrinal basis is relatively straightforward and short.
Standard evangelical basis of faith, basically.
And I guess people might say, well, churches need to have more than this sometimes, but it doesn't stop a church having a longer basis of faith, does it?
Absolutely. A good example of that is with baptism. So churches often ask me, what position do FIEC take on baptism? Well, we don't take a position on baptism other than saying we believe in baptism, but we don't take a position on the mode of baptism, and that's where it's important distinction, I think. So a church can join if it's Pedo Baptist, a church can join if it's Credo Baptist, a church can join if it's dual practice with baptism. So we believe in baptism, and that's in our statement of faith, but actually the mode of baptism is not in the statement of faith.
I think it's also worth saying when churches join FIEC, they're also free to belong to other associations as well. So FIEC is not like a denomination that says that FIEC needs to be the sole group that you belong to or to become your defining and primary identity. So lots of our churches are involved in all sorts of other gospel kind of gatherings. Well, there are lots of churches that would belong to, for example, gospel partnerships. There are churches that would belong to different groupings of independent churches like the Evangelical Fellowship of Congregational Churches. It's possible to be able to belong to both. Churches from a Grace Baptist background may well continue to belong to Grace Baptist associations. Churches may well join groups like Acts 29, which would have a particular focus on church planting. And we encourage our churches. We want them to be serving in whatever way is possible and investing in other networks and other groupings that help them to accomplish their mission. And different churches within FIEC will put FIEC affiliation and FIEC membership at a higher level of priority for the church's own self-identity. So for some churches, FIEC is a primary identity. For some churches, FIEC is sort of one group that they belong to that helps them have a national vision, but they put lots of energy into other groupings that they belong to as well. And that's absolutely fine, because it's all about enabling the local church to fulfill the mission that the local church believes God has given to it. So our goal is to serve churches and enable them to be effective in fulfilling their mission, rather than dictating to them what that mission should be.
Phil, you just hinted at something else that churches have to agree to, which is these ethos statements, we call them. Just tell us briefly what they are.
So John mentioned them earlier. So same-sex marriage. So we believe that marriage is between ecumenism, gospel ministry and ecumenism is one of the statements. That is that churches will only have partnership with other churches that believe the same core evangelical convictions, particularly when it comes to mission, evangelism, joint worship. So churches could perhaps work this out on the ground in different ways. So maybe with co-belligerents or the like, you could work with churches that may take a more liberal stance. But actually, when it comes to mission and evangelism, the gospel is too important. So therefore, you can only gather with other churches that believe the same core evangelical convictions. The way that cashes out is that a church can't belong to FIEC and also be part of Churches Together. So if you go on the Churches Together in England website, for example, you'll see that there's everybody who identifies as a church is welcome in Churches Together. That would even include Unitarians who don't believe in the Trinity. There's even a statement on there about Jehovah's Witnesses. It might be possible for them to join churches together in some circumstances. So we can't have churches within FIEC who are also in a formal churches together movement. And the third ethos statement is about women in ministry. So we're really positive about women in ministry. Lots of wonderful roles for females and women in ministry. But we believe that the office of elder and pastor is only open to suitably qualified, gifted, and the right characteristics for blokes. So that's the key kind of three ethos statements.
Well, I guess we'll come back to this, some of those at a different time in different episodes. But John, I'm going to ask you a question about those. Why draw the lines there on those three?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I think we need to say how those lines are drawn. And it's really important to say that those ethos statements and the doctrinal basis are decided by the churches themselves.
Absolutely.
Again, there's no central controlling body that has dictated that must be the case. The FIEC works by having an annual assembly in which representatives of all of the churches are able to attend and vote. And all of those positions have been adopted by the churches collectively by massively overwhelming majorities. So the reason why we draw those boundary lines is because that's where the churches of FIEC have felt that those boundary lines need to be drawn. And I guess the reason for that is because they enable us to work together as a fellowship of churches. So, for example, particularly in relation to women's ministry, we don't say that that is a gospel position and that people hold a different view on women's ministry are not believers and not evangelicals, and we can't work together with them. But as a fellowship, if you, for example, have a position of divergent views on women's ministry, it's very difficult to operate collectively where one of your responsibilities is to accredit ministers, because you would find yourself in the position of accrediting sort of people to ministry who a large section of the constituency wouldn't believe should be in ministry and in office. So the vast majority of our churches couldn't in conscience accredit, for example, women to be pastors and elders of churches. And when you begin to try to do things together, like have conferences, again, it would be very difficult to maintain unity. And I think churches that have tried to have a dual position on, for example, women's ministry and women's leadership, it's been very, very difficult for them to maintain that unity. So we felt it's much more important to simply be honest about what we are and then try to have good gospel fellowship with those who belong to other groups who would take a different view on those sort of issues. So not every boundary that we draw is a gospel boundary in terms of we're saying you ought not to have anything to do with people who hold a different view. Some of them are about the internal coherence and unity of FIEC. And they're boundaries that we think, because they are biblical, they're important to defend. But they're not separating boundaries in terms of those are reasons for not having fellowship with others.
And presumably within those boundaries, there are differences of how they work out in practice. So complementarianism is a good example. Would every church in the FIEC look the same?
Oh no. I mean, the FIEC positions we've talked about are ones that are, in the end, they maintain our unity as a fellowship. But that doesn't mean to say that we've dictated, for example, what a local church must do in relation to women's ministry in the life of the local church. So there's a spectrum of opinion within FIEC churches as to the significance of the difference between men and women and how they operate and how they function. So they would have different views, for example, on whether women are able to lead services or not. They would have different views on whether you might have women deacons within the life of a church. There are a small number of FIEC churches that would take the view that women can preach under the authority of elders in the life of the church. That would be very much a minority view, and the majority would take the view that sort of the teaching ministry in the church is for the elders and for the pastors. But yes, there's a wide spectrum. I think an increasing number of FIEC churches are recognising the vital importance of training women to be equipped in Bible handling so that they can teach and disciple other women. An increasing number of churches are employing women to serve in the church in that way and to provide pastoral support in the life of churches. So within the whole kind of different views about sort of the role of women within local churches, there would be a significant diversity of practice at an FIEC level. And in some ways, that statement on women's ministry epitomises the way that FIEC works. It draws a wide boundary within which there's an awful lot of freedom for the local church to make its own decision as to what it believes is right under Scripture.
You just hinted by talking about the annual general meeting about something about the way that FIEC is run. In kind of its structure. Phil, just tell us a little bit more about that. How does accountability work and those sorts of things in terms of those who are employed by the FIEC and the services that are provided and their relationship to the churches?
So obviously we have a senior leadership team who serve within the FIEC, but actually we are accountable to a 12-man trust board. The FIEC trustees are men drawn from FIEC churches. So what I mean by that is every year a nomination form goes out to ask for new trustees to join the fellowship. They must be from FIEC churches. So that means that we are accountable to
Anybody
the churches.
from FIEC church, or do they have to be in a leadership?
No, don't have to be in a leadership position.
Okay.
They have to be a member of an FIEC church. So we can have, I think the majority are pastors, not all of them, but the majority are, but they don't have to be. But what that means is that we are accountable to the churches through the trustees. And that's really, really important. So it's not about us sitting in our head office deciding on the direction of the fellowship. There are trustees who oversee the charity, oversee the finances of the charity, oversee the direction of the charity, and they are accountable to the churches every year at the annual general meeting. And of course, churches are free to bring things to the general meeting for discussion. So I think the Constitution says 15 FIEC churches, if they came together and said, we'd really like the annual general meeting to consider this matter, it would then be brought onto the agenda of the annual general meeting. So it's not the case that, if you like, the power in FIEC is held with one person in John or a few people in the senior leadership team. Really, we are our churches, and that is where the accountability is ultimately held.
And John, why is there a need for such a large staff? And you might look at the list on the website and see, I don't know how many people there are now.
About 20, not all full time, but about 20.
Why do we need all these people? What do they do? What was the job of the FIEC staff centrally?
Well, the job of the FIEC staff is to serve the churches, to help them to be effective in their gospel ministry. And I guess the staff has grown as the fellowship has grown, and as the expectations of the churches and what they would like to do, what they would like us to do by way of serving them, has also grown. So we've expanded. The FIEC has always had a central staff. It's been relatively small. And then from 2010 onwards, when we restructured FIEC to be more effective in serving and helping churches, we've employed more staff centrally, particularly with a focus on sort of gospel ministry rather than administrative support. So we've sought to provide support for churches in relation to training, in relation to their mission. We've wanted to invest in promoting biblical women's ministry. We've wanted to provide support, for example, to smaller churches, so that the staff have been brought on board to help the churches to be effective in their ministry. The money and the funding for that has come from the churches themselves. So the way that FIEC is funded is by voluntary donation from the churches. So as the churches have generously given and the amount of resources have increased, we've been able to add in strategically full-time and part-time staff to enable sort of particular needs of the churches to be met. So the staff exist to serve the churches. And I think it's inevitable that as the scale of FIEC has grown, and also perhaps as some of the pressures on local church leaders have grown in the cultural climate in which we find ourselves, it seemed wise to invest in more gifted people to be able to help serve the churches. And again, I think that provision of help and support and the availability of it is one of the reasons why 200 churches have chosen to join. I think in the past, for some churches, they saw FIEC as basically essentially like an insurance service. They liked the idea that FIEC was there, but it was only something you would turn to if you had an emergency or you needed some practical support. I think what we've sought to do is to try to say, actually, that's not the primary purpose of FIEC. The primary purpose of FIEC is to help and support churches in their gospel ministry locally and nationally. And in order to be able to do that, you need staff who are able to give their time to it. But at the same time, lots of time and energy is given to helping and supporting FIEC by pastors and leaders within FIEC through teams and people giving their time and available. And again, the central staff team are often facilitating and organising leaders within FIEC to be able to give their time effectively to help support other churches.
You say voluntary donation and contributions. I've had a look on the website and I've seen the list of how much you pay depending on how many members you've got. Phil, it's just jolly expensive to belong to the FIEC, isn't it?
Well, it depends how you view it. So I think it works out at about 50 pence per member per week.
So how does this work? That there's a list of donation levels, but it's voluntary. How does that work?
Yeah, so essentially we say to churches, look, this is the amount of money that churches of your size, with a membership of your size, typically give to the FIEC. And we set those levels on an annual basis. We decide in our budgets whether we're going to increase those amounts or not. So the larger your church, the more your expected donation will be. What we're really saying is this is the amount of money that churches a similar size to you will give on an annual basis to FIEC. Now, some churches can afford to give more. Some churches can only afford to give less. Some churches will give to our general fund, but they'll also give to our training fund or our mission fund, which helps support workers being raised up for ministry, the training fund, or supporting mission initiatives with the mission fund. So there's lots of ways in which money comes in, but ultimately we're saying to churches, look, we can only do our ministry if you're prepared to be generous.
Is it really voluntary?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are churches who are within FIEC who give very little or nothing at all. Others who will give more than 100% of their donation because they recognise the importance of the ministry. So the idea of being a fellowship is we're not saying there's a fee that you pay to join the FIEC. We're saying we want to ask you to make a voluntary donation if you believe in our work and ministry. And what I think has been really interesting is in the past 18 months, so we're recording this just towards the end, we hope and pray, of the coronavirus pandemic. That might not age very well, that comment, might it? But what we hope is going to be the final kind of lifting of lockdown restrictions. But over this past 18 months, churches who are not part of the FIEC, but who've been benefiting from the resources we've been able to make available, have given donations to us, even though they're not part of us, because they recognise the importance of that ministry. So we would hope that the resource we were able to pass to churches, the way we're able to support churches with their ministry and mission, helps them to think that is money well spent in terms of donating to the work and ministry of the fellowship.
And it's worth saying, isn't it, John? We're not a fundraising organisation. No. We are funded by our churches, aren't we? And that's a deliberate decision, is it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that follows from the fact that we are a network of churches. We don't, in that sense, see ourselves as kind of a body that is seeking to raise all sorts of external funds to distribute. We don't want to be like that. And as Phil said, our funding model is that it's the churches that give to enable us to do the work that serves them. It's actually built into our constitution that we're not able to charge a fee, that we can only ask for a donation. And actually, wonderfully, year on year, even though we're only asking for a donation, the churches have generously given and our needs have been met. So we've seen that this model, and it's actually not unlike what you find in, for example, 2 Corinthians, the idea, give what you are able. And our suggested donation figures are an indication of what sort of we need. And then it's for the local church to decide whether or not they're able to give in that way. And we recognise, for example, that churches' positions will change financially from year to year, depending on, for example, whether the church is engaging in its own mission project or whether it's engaging in a building programme. So this model enables churches to give in the light of their own circumstances. Now, we actually have received donations from sort of outside bodies and from individuals and even from our own churches that have enabled us to have a training fund and a mission fund that have been able to invest in gospel work. And that's been a wonderful blessing, that we've been able to use money to help people, for example, train at theological college, to help churches to employ assistant ministers to come and have a training role for a couple of years in a local church, to invest in church plants and mission initiatives. But that's not our main purpose, and that's not our main function. Where that money has come in, and sometimes it's not been sought by us, it's just been generously given, we've been delighted to use it to advance the gospel. But we think it's far more important to be spending our time supporting the local gospel ministry of churches rather than seeking to raise significant funds and then controlling how those are used. And that's precisely because we don't want to be like a denomination. And one of the ways denominations exercise control is by the use of central funds. And that's why we don't require churches to give us money. And it's why we don't see ourselves as first and foremost a fundraising body that's then going to distribute grants to churches.
Thanks, that's a helpful clarification. Now, some of the things we've talked about, we will come back to in future episodes. We're planning to think a little bit more about gender and marriage. We're planning to think a little bit more about collaborations and how that works. Thinking especially about our ethos statements. We're thinking to come back several times, planning to come back several times to think about women's ministry. So do come and join us for those future episodes. But for now, thank you, boys, very much. Let me pray as we finish. Heavenly Father, thank you for the vision of Edward Paul Connor as he started the work of FIEC almost 100 years ago. Thank you for the blessing it's been to many independent churches. as they've enjoyed the fellowship that comes from being part of FIEC. Please will you continue to bless this work, we pray, not so that FIEC itself as an organisation might thrive, but so that churches might be strengthened and enabled to do the work you've called them to do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to Independence, the FIEC podcast. For more resources for church leaders, subscribe to this podcast on your favourite podcast app and visit our website at fiec.org.uk.